Script writing is hard. There are a million balances to strike, not the least of which is judging just how much information to give your audience. Explain too little and your reader either won't understand what's going on or won't feel satisfied. Explain too much and, well, your art becomes like the movies on this list. That's not to say this impulse to explain isn't understandable. As stated before, there are consequences for under-explaining, and moreover, it makes sense that a writer would want to reveal more about the fictional world they've put their readers in. And in that respect, all the films on this list are due a bit of sympathy. Nonetheless, they are all lessons in the value of leaving some things a bit vague in fiction, of leaving audiences a bit of an imaginative space in the narrative where their own minds can conjure things much more affecting than a simple explanation ever could. I am Kirsten from What Culture, and these are 10 movies that explained way too much. Number 10, The Ring, 2002. The whole central conceit of dying 7 days after watching a cursed videotape is an interesting one. It leaves a ticking clock hanging over the events of the film, increasing tension and scares as the film progresses. However, certain explanations take away from that same tension. For example, it's discovered that the ghostly antagonist of the film, Samara, was killed after being enclosed in a well. How long can one survive in a well? 7 days, states the protagonist of the film. It all comes across a little bit silly. A ghost gives you 7 days to die after watching a videotape because it took her 7 days to starve or die of thirst in a well? Aside from that logic being specious at best, it also robs the central conceit of the movie of its mystique. Instead of being this almost random ticking clock, one that embodies a vague fear generated by the growing prevalence of in-home media consumption, we learn that it's all actually due to a girl surviving a very particular amount of time in a well somewhere. Now, giving answers to the viewer is basically a necessity in a film like this, an investigative horror movie that's as much detective fiction as horror fiction. However, trying to tie up all loose ends inevitably ends in some silliness that will undercut the more impactful horror moments of this film, as is the case here. Number 9, Hannibal Rising. Hannibal, as a character both in the novels and the films, tended to get less interesting the more the post-Silence of the Lambs works focused on him, and that trend reached its peak with Hannibal Rising, a film that tries to take a deep dive into a transgressive, mysterious character and ends up making him a pretty standard revenge thriller anti-hero. One of the best things about Hannibal is that there is something otherworldly about him. Mads Mikkelsen and Anthony Hopkins both managed to expertly layer their performance with a hint of something alien, something not quite human. Instead of preserving that mystique, Hannibal Rising teaches us that Hannibal became like this because of the Nazis. The movie itself explains Hannibal's origin through his quest for revenge after a group of German soldiers who killed his beloved sister. If you wanted to know what made Hannibal that fantastic villain who you could never quite comprehend, that's it. Nazis and revenge. I have nothing but sympathy for the people who had to make this film. They were making a film whose entire point is ultimately to undermine one of 20th century cinema's most memorable villains. The NBC Hannibal series managed to engage with this material and salvage it, using it to bring us closer in sympathy to Hannibal without removing that sense of otherworldliness. Exploring Hannibal's background, it seems, can be done in a way that respects what made the character great. Hannibal Rising just wasn't the film to do it, and to even consider its canon is to mostly destroy the Hannibal Lecter we became invested in the first place. Number 8, The Rise of Skywalker. It would be easy to talk about the Star Wars prequels here, which over-explained everything from the Force to the origins of C-3PO. However, the newest Star Wars film makes some similar mistakes, but in reverse. It makes a lot of the mistakes prequels make, but in a sequel. The Rise of Skywalker takes a few interesting concepts and ideas, such as Rey's parentage, and goes full prequel with them, explaining them to death in thematically uninteresting ways. The previous film, The Last Jedi, seemed to acknowledge that its story was happening in a big universe. You aren't going to get all the answers you want. It stepped a bit away from the idea of Star Wars just being a story about a couple of important lineages being heroic and or villainous with the fate of the galaxy in their hands. The Rise of Skywalker undoes this, with its explanation that actually Rey does belong to one of these lineages, that she's not just a heroic person who must find her own way, but part of a Force dyad. It undoes all of that interesting work of the previous film, putting us squarely back in kind of a Star Wars autopilot, where the same stories, same themes, same tropes get repeated ad nauseum. It retroactively robs this new trilogy of its own possibility to be something new and interesting. Number 7. Prometheus. First of all, Prometheus is not a bad film. It does a lot of really clever things, in fact. However, here again we see a drive to over-explain, both in terms of its own plot and in terms of the wider Alien series. Late in the movie, we figure out that the person funding the expedition the main characters are on to discover the origin of humanity has been on their spaceship all along. Moreover, he is the father of the ruthless leader of the mission. The problem here is that it misunderstands why paternity reveals like the "I'm your father" of The Empire Strikes Back, or even that of Pixar's Coco, are interesting. Someone's lineage isn't that interesting on its own. This lineage reveal needs to interrogate characters' motivations or push characters in interesting directions. Here, it serves little purpose. It perhaps explains the motivations of one character, but it ultimately doesn't much change the course of the film. Perhaps the more grievous error here, though, is that it undermines what came before, especially in the first Alien film. The monster is just something you encounter out in space. It's a horrifying, unexplained creature that operates under different biological logic than you. The thought of being isolated and encountering this thing you cannot explain is terrifying. Less so when you know exactly where it came from and why. Number 6. Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest. Dead Man's Chest isn't a great sequel for a few reasons, but one detail of that movie is just so indicative of how the charm of the first film started to get pushed out of the ensuing films in order to provide a more epic, almost Tolkien-esque narrative. In Curse of the Black Pearl, Captain Jack Sparrow has a compass that does not point north. It's a quirky detail, perfectly fitting with a character who is never completely on top of things, but somehow manages to come out on top anyway. In the sequel, this compass turns from a quirky object that's fitting with Jack's character to a powerful magical artifact that eventually takes a mythic importance. The problem here is that what was a silly detail that helped add charm to a silly but charming story becomes a tremendously dramatic, important mythic artifact and, in translation, something gets lost. It's a small detail, but it's indicative of kind of a switch in tone that was made between Pirates 1 and 2. A quirky silliness that added so much fun to the original starts to get converted into attempts at epic fantasy, irreversibly charting a course for the franchise away from its entertaining start point. Number 5. Jason Bourne. If you can assign an overriding criticism to the film Jason Bourne, a sequel to the original Jason Bourne trilogy, it is that the franchise as a whole would be better if it didn't exist. It's not a bad film, but it commits the sin of telling us what happens next when we really don't need to know. The biggest error then is basically in the premise of the film itself. Saying exactly what happened to Jason Bourne after Bourne Ultimatum just distracts from the power of that ending. We get a revenge plot about Jason going after the man who killed his father, a man Jason is only just now remembering. We see characters who survived the original trilogy and whose survival was important to the denouement of those films, getting gunned down in the early moments of the new film. A powerful, fitting ending is replaced with more of the same kind of Jason Bourne shenanigans we saw in the other films, but while those events felt like they were building to something, this one felt like it was tearing down what had been built. Number 4. Sinister. One half of Sinister is an excellent horror film. For the first hour or so, the film is effective and frightening. Then, like in The Ring, we start to learn the rules in detail. We also start seeing the monster more and more. The monster's mythology also starts to get revealed with increasing clarity. The problem here is the problem of many horror films. The more you explain, the less scary things often become. That's not always the case, but it is frequently so. Whereas before, the film teemed with a generalised fear about a power that can exert control over children, turn them against their families who can wreak havoc, now the film has a knowable monster who can be named, identified at first sight, and whose horror seems less applicable to the viewer. We learn so much about it, and as a result the film loses the fear it so expertly built up in its first hour. Number 3. The Ritual. The Ritual is a really effective horror film that you should watch. The over-explanation on display here is not as damaging as the kind in Sinister. Even on a conceptual level, learning more about the central monster of the film doesn't dissipate the Ritual's scares quite in the way learning about Bagul's dissipates horror in Sinister. Ultimately, the over-explaining in this movie is of a simpler kind. We just see too much of the monster. The way the monster operates remains fascinating and terrifying. Moreover, it's revealed more and more, we can see that its design is actually really cool. But with this kind of visual explanation of what it is at the root of the horror film we've been watching, its power seems to diminish a bit. Rather than being some Lovecraftian horror that cannot be completely pinned down hunting down the main characters, we get chases involving the main characters and a well-defined singular monster. Much of this could have been helped even just by obscuring the monster that little bit more, by withholding that visual explanation from us. But by seeing it in the flesh, it loses that terrifying quality that only obscurity can provide. Number 2, The Wicker Man. Look, I know this is an easy film to dislike. It's not good. It's unintentionally funny at best. Yet I think there's a particular moment of over-explanation where we can see how 2006's The Wicker Man completely lost sight of what made the original 1973 film haunting. If you haven't seen it, Nick Cage, a policeman in the film, follows his ex to an island ruled by, to his horror, women, in order to rescue his daughter who may be in trouble. It turns out he's being lured into a trap by the women that is meant to revive their stagnating honey production. The original had interesting commentary on religion. The new one tried to provide gender commentary and failed in spectacular and frankly offensive fashion. One can see though how these mistakes might emerge from the makers of the new film miscalculating how to use elements of the old film to make the new one work. But in showing us what happens after the famous burning Wicker Man scene, the film shows us that these mistakes are not just miscalculations in the remaking process, but are instead a complete misunderstanding of the original. The whole tension with the ending, original and new, is that you don't know if the sacrifice works. If anyone didn't see the 2006 film in theatres, which is most everyone, you've probably seen this ending. However, the original theatrical ending explains what happens after this, and man, do you immediately understand why they cut it. The movie jumps to 6 months after the Wicker Man burning and shows a couple of women on an island seducing James Franco and Jason Ritter, implying that they will end up eventually doing the same thing that they did to Nick Cage. The issue here, it undergoes the ending of the film. As stated above, the terror of Wicker Man's ending is that you cannot tell who is right. What is happening is horrifying, but the man being burned is also not a great person and his worldview is not a positive one. Though the 2006 movie does gloss over this quite a bit. To show that they are starting this whole seduction process again 6 months later means the sacrifice didn't work. That's it. We're just dealing with a bunch of crazy women entrapping good policemen. There's no social critique, no intrigue, no lingering doubts. In its attempt to basically do the ender of the thriller video, showing that the horror continues on, they completely explode the film and show the complete incompetence of the whole endeavour. Number 1, The Last Exorcism. This found footage film's over-explanation is a strange case. In some ways, the ending of the film doesn't explain much at all. We get a big reveal, characters make some split-second decisions, seemingly everyone dies. Fade to black. But the issue here is that while leaving much unresolved plot-wise, the film resolves something thematically that might have been best left ambiguous. The narrative up until that point did a great job of riding the fence between belief and skepticism. A young woman appears to be possessed, but it remains unclear whether or not this is actually the case. As the film generally revolves around the pastor treating her, who is experiencing a crisis of faith, this ambiguity works quite well. We are actually stuck in with this crisis of faith and how it's intensified by this potential demonic possession because we have the experience shifting levels of belief and doubt alongside him. And then it's revealed that the woman was possessed. Though the plot leaves much up to the imagination, why has she been possessed? What are the goals of those assisting with the possession? Who of the main cast is actually dead, and what will become of the woman? It is shown to us in no uncertain terms that what we have witnessed is demonic. We get a lack of resolution plot-wise, while thematically all the interesting ambiguity and interplay between faith and doubt is gone. It's a truly strange case where under and over-explaining is combined for a rather unsatisfying ending that isn't worthy of the ambiguous, compelling movie that precedes it. And that's our list. Do you think these movies explain too much? Leave us a comment down below and let us know. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. But for now, I have been Kirsten from What Culture, and I will see you in the next video.